People will have their own personal biases and their own personal notices.
Sometimes it works, but a lot of the time it doesn't. More influenced or more exposed to Western ideas.
I think that's where people go wrong a lot.
To know what to study and to learn about. I slip away from myself and I go entirely by instinct.
You can do your own research, find your own answers.
Focus on all the amazing things that are ahead of you. More tools to use.
How much is this information worth and why do I want it?
It evolves in kind of a natural, strange way. Just let it grow how it grows.
Everything around you is your tool.
You have to expand your horizons. Do as thou wilt. Your practice is your practice.
Magic is magic.
When you change, that's okay and that's normal and part of human development.
My name is AIDEN.
My name is GEORGINA. And my name is Nike. Welcome to Occultism with a Side of Salt.
Hello, my name is AIDEN.
And my name is Nike.
My name is GEORGINA, and you're listening to Occultism with a Side of Salt. In this episode, we're going to talk about a topic that we've been thinking about talking about for a while, but has become a little more relevant recently. We're talking about how mythology, folklore, and folk tales, and religious tales are taken literally a lot of the time, and how that's kind of a toxic way to view it. Mythology and religious storytelling is our basic grasp of all of the universe. It's a founding thing that exists across all religions, across all cultures, and is the basis of the majority of our religious understanding. We've grown up around these stories, we were taught them in school, and they really do fill our lives, and these narratives have so many purposes to them. But when we talk about these religious narratives, we need to remember that they're mostly not meant to be taken literally. When we look at storytelling, we're looking at a story, right? Rather than a history book. And I think a big problem in the pagan, especially, this video is going to be very pagan-centric, because we see pagans doing this a lot, though you do see this quite a bit in the Abrahamic, especially Christian environments. What I think is very pertinent right now is the pagan understanding of this, and how pagans have become taking mythology literally, even to the point when there are videos of people talking about being scared that Fae are going to kill them, or that they're going to kill Lucifer through some sort of ritual, or even the common trope of a mystic developing messianic delusions. And so mythological literalism is something that can begin innocuously, but can come actually quite dangerous and risky, especially to one's personal psyche. So through this podcast episode, we're going to be talking about how mythology evolves, how us applying modern constructions to mythology is actually a little tricky, and not necessarily how mythology is meant to be interpreted, the way that you can actually look at a myth and extract certain things and go, oh, this is how I'm going to use that in my magical practice, and kind of how to decode myth, and how to make myths something that you can use pragmatically rather than seeing it as a history textbook.
We often see this also more with the more common modern, especially Abrahamic religions, but it's definitely a thing that we do in the pagan community, I would say, maybe a little too much.
I think when we examine myth, we need to realize that religious practices aren't the same thing as the myths themselves. Typically, religious practices derive from mythology, like, say, the Yom Kippur rite, where you scapegoat the goat as a representation of Azazel, right? Like, that religious rite comes directly from a myth. But certain religious rites you look at, say, various prayers and hymns, don't. So, and then there are certain myths that we don't extract practices from at all, and are more just guiding lessons to help us go through our lives. And so, mythology is not something you can always perfectly look at and turn into a religious practice. When you look at myths, you want to see what plants are mentioned, what animals are mentioned, and what the behavior of the characters, I say characters like to represent all spirits, because not all myths are about gods, are doing, but the myth itself is not exactly what the religion is, and a lot of religious beliefs, especially the philosophical side, while you see that reflected in a myth, the philosophies aren't always directly layered into the myths, and so when you look at a myth or a story, that's not the same as like religious principles and philosophies, because when we look at religion is a combination of practices, beliefs, stories, and culture. Religion is not just one thing, it's a whole like complex term. And there's a really interesting video from Religion for Breakfast about how religion is something you do, whereas a myth is like a story. So religion is actually a very complex thing, and myths are just one aspect of that, though they are pretty important.
It's also important to examine the reason behind myths and more of like what purpose they serve within a religious context. So, we've mentioned that there's myths to explain things, there's myths to give moral guidelines. Some myths are more of moral lessons, like, see the mistakes that this person in this story has made and don't repeat them, or here's the consequences of what happens when this thing happens. Some of them are to explain why certain things exist, like mountains, or thunder and lightning, or certain creatures. We obviously have, human creation myths, but there's plenty of other creature creation myths, or what roles those creatures play. And we see a lot more of these explanations in more of like herbal folklore, in regards to their uses both magically and medicinally, and so we have the myths to help explain that. So I think it's important that we understand the myths aren't meant to be taken 100% literally. We're supposed to examine them and understand why that myth exists.
Yeah, I think herbal folklore actually can bring into another thing that you need to consider when you look at why myths exist, and that is the cultural context of the teller of the myth. When you look at a myth, it's being told by a person at some point. Someone wrote this down, and whoever wrote this down has biases of their time period and their personal religion. Herbal folklore, I think, is a really great way to look at this, because when you look at certain plants, especially poisonous plants in the nightshade family, when you see pagan myths about them, you see a lot of chthonic mythos, but they aren't seen as devils, right? They aren't seen as plants of the devil. And when you look at folk names of plants, like, you can see that these older names are different than what happens post-Christianization. Then when you look at folklore around these plants post-Christianization, especially the nightshades, they're considered of the devil, or trumpets to the underworld, or gates to the underworld. But the way that the myths about them in pagan mythology and the way that the Christian European mythology looks, though, I mean, this is more folklore than mythology, but that's semantics, the stories are radically different, and they tell a different story about the plant, even though a lot of the, like, characteristics, like them being chthonic, them being kind of toxic, them being a gate to other worlds, is the same. The way they're depicted is radically different based on cultural context and the time period. And so when you look at myths, you need to realize, okay, these weren't directly told by the gods, they were told by some person at some point in time. Someone was the person who picked this up and wrote this down, and if it was something that was passed on orally for many generations, at some point someone did write that down, and that person could have easily tweaked things. And so knowing what time period your myth comes from and who wrote it and who's telling you this narrative is key to kind of getting into the core of the myth, because people claim they're unbiased, right? I don't think that's true. I think every single person has biases that are subconsciously in them based on where they come from, their cultures, their personal beliefs, and even if they try really hard to not let that come through, it always kind of seeps through. And so when you're looking at mythology, you really do need to pay attention to that. Pay attention to your translators, right? If it's been translated, those translators could have had biases and picked slightly different words based on their own personal beliefs and preferences. So it's just, when we look at mythology, we need to remember that this was written by a human, not the gods themselves. So you have to take everything with a grain of salt, because people are not really super reliable, and we can't fully comprehend the divine. The divine is kind of beyond our full conception.
One of my favorites to look at in a lot of these regards, because some myths, they change over time and with historical context and all that, but some of them are just pure geography. Aphrodite is my favorite to look at for a lot of this, which is in Sparta, there are statues. We know it's Aphrodite. We know that they are of her specifically, but she's in armor, and she's considered a war goddess. And this has to do, in part, with her origins as being, at the very least, related to, maybe even directly translated as Inanna/Ishtar from across the sea. And so that connection of being a war goddess, that's just her there. When you go to other parts of Greece, even during that same period, obviously we get more of the myths that we understand Aphrodite as, in the more modern context, as being love and beauty and all that. But that war goddess part of her is huge in Sparta. And so just geographically, at the same time, even in the same, what we consider country, the same region, it's going to be different depending on the context. Sparta had a lot more warrior-type aspects to it versus the rest of Greece, which was a little bit more philosophical and lofty and that kind of stuff. So the war stuff was less relevant to them, and so that depiction of her was going to be different. There's also, like, the context of her actual creation myth, and that whole coming across the ocean and her being born of sea foam. Some of them are really down to the context of, like, where did they even come from? We have wanderer deities. Dionysus might have been from a different place, and he's considered a quote-unquote outsider god even within the Greek myths. So it might be pointing to the fact that he came from another place with wanderers.
And so, like how these myths have crossed cultures and crossed geography, when it crosses time periods, it changes. And that brings us into kind of our modern views on mythology and folklore, and the folklore that is still forming today. When we're people in 2020, right? I guess you could be listening to this in a future year, but at the time of recording, it's 2020. And so a lot of these myths and the way they're structured are difficult to apply to modern culture, especially the really old ones. So when you look at these myths, they're not gonna match with our lifestyles currently, and the way our culture is set up. We want to, like, in general, people want things to match them, and that people want things to connect with them and be something that they identify with. So when we look at mythology, it's hard to kind of pull off the modern lens and view things in the culture that they were from. Because when you're looking at mythology, the cultural context is so critical. And so when we, in 2020, start applying modern concepts and modern things that didn't exist back then to mythology, things get really tricky really fast, because while it's interesting to do that, it's extremely difficult to hold a historic society up to modern standards.
We see this a lot with LGBT content, and I say this speaking as a bisexual, non-binary person. I love being able to identify traits of myself in different deities and their mythologies, and to connect with my modern LGBT culture with that myth. But we also have to remember that queer culture as we understand it now is not what it was back then. I believe it's Sparta is where we have the knowledge that the male soldiers would sleep with their fellow male soldiers to build a sense of camaraderie so that you would fight harder for your peers, but you were also expected to have a wife that you would then build a family, have kids with, that whole deal. And we didn't consider them all to be bisexual because that didn't exist. It wasn't a term or a then modern context that they would have existed within. It just wasn't the same. And we can identify now that that is a thing that looks very much like how we identify it, but we can't say that it is in fact that thing. We see it a lot with Dionysus and Loki and Odin and Athena and a lot of other gods that we identify as either like non-binary or bisexual or gender fluid, or maybe even I've seen people identify Athena as being a lesbian because she's a virginal goddess and so she never, has a husband or anything. But we have to remember that modern LGBT culture cannot be applied in the past because it didn't have our same culture, so they would never have identified as that, and if you told a Spartan he was bisexual or gay, he probably would have killed you.
I think this is like a really big thing, especially with gender, because the modern concept of gender has changed completely throughout the years. There's all sorts of different gods of different what we would call different genders that back then they didn't really have a gender for them. Like I see a lot of people calling certain like more primordial gods agender, even though they don't. While they lack agender, they are not agender because agender is a modern construction that is also applied to humans. Because one thing that I personally believe is that every spirit doesn't really have a gender because gender is a human construct. It's not a divine construct, if that makes sense. So these spirits, like they are feminine, masculine, neutral, a little bit of both, something else entirely, but they are not a specific gender. And that also goes with sexuality. Apollo isn't bisexual, for example, because bisexual is once again a human construct, a modern human construct, that it doesn't apply to the divine.
Yeah, I mean, in the end, deities are not physical, corporeal beings. And so even outside of a mythological perspective, it's really hard to apply human traits onto a supernal, transcendental being, right? Whether you take the approach that all these deities are archetypes of the same source energy, or you see them as separate, one thing that's universal is that they don't have physical bodies, they don't have forms in the same way that we do. So when we talk about metaphysical gender, it gets really tricky really fast, because they don't really have gender, because they don't have bodies, there's no like gender expectations or gender constructions or gendered cultures put onto a deity, right? They don't grow up in a society that has gender constructed like we do. Like, as humans in the modern era, we grow up in a society where gender is enforced upon us, whether we like it or not, and we're expected to somewhat conform to that. Gods don't have that, because gods aren't raised. Gods don't have social interactions. Gods don't have anything that we live through. And so applying human experience to a being is really, really difficult, because we can't even understand them fully, right? Like, these supernal things are beyond our human comprehension. And so I feel like when you throw these labels that are modern human labels, and largely our understanding of gender comes from our society, whereas in these historic societies, like, you see multiple genders, you see things like two-spirit, you see all these very different understandings of gender. It's very difficult to apply only one understanding of gender, which is our modern 2020 American Western one, onto all these other cultures and societies. It becomes really difficult, and I think it's interesting. Like, genuinely, I think it's really interesting to speculate or to write essays about this or look at mythology and kind of this postmodern understanding. But we can't make that objective fact, because it's a postmodern reading of something. It's not what the original thing is. So that's my personal opinion on that. We don't mean to upset anyone or, like, demean anyone who really has these understandings or sees it as a way to connect with their identity deeper by seeing their identity reflected. I just think that it's difficult to make a god a human.
And to reiterate on that point, I think it might be best phrased as, it's okay if you see those traits that you now identify as what we consider queer culture, as long as you're not saying objectively, this is what the myth was meant to say, this is how it is meant to be interpreted, this is the way it was meant to be written, and how the ancients meant for that myth to be read and seen. Because it's not. It's fine if you take that and you take lessons from it as, whatever modern cultural thing, especially with LGBT stuff, if you want to take that as a connection point and an understanding point and how you may view them, that's fine. Just don't try to say that it is historical fact that Dionysus was non-binary or Loki was bisexual or whatever. As long as you're not trying to change the context of the myths from the time that they were written, I think it's fine to identify with them.
Yeah, I mean, mythology evolves and mythology changes, and as I was saying earlier, our biases and lenses impact how we see things. I think when you're pulling myth into your practice, and you're really into these kind of postmodern interpretations of mythology, I think you should be a little careful with what you're doing, because when you extract myth into your practice, rather than following, like, say, a grimoire or, like, instructions or a teacher or whatever. And I think mythology is where so many of these original practices devise that it's actually very smart to look at myths and extract things on your own. But when you're doing that, I think it's best to try to see the myth as source text as you can when you're creating religious practices based upon mythology. Obviously, we can't really stop our own biases and lenses from impacting that, but when you look at a myth to develop practices by, say, you read a myth about dancing fae in the forest, right? And so you want to connect to the fae by dancing because you see fae doing that. So that makes sense, right? I think it's important to just be careful, because creating your own practice and intuitive magic is obviously a little higher risk than following what other people have done before, but it can be so rewarding. And I think for that type of stuff, since I think taking things directly from myth is something a lot of practitioners are interested in, you should try to be as source material as possible. Just personally, I think that will make the transition from myth to an original thing you're adding to your practice for the first time a little smoother. But once again, that's my own perspective.
An example of how this can be done, extracting myth to make a practice, is, for example, I work with the Greek divine spirit, chaos, and there's not a lot of history behind it. So I found the creation myth, I looked through that, and I found that it has its own children, it has its own kind of lineage from there, and that's how the world came to be. So I took that and I formed a ritual using the spirits that I'm familiar with through these myths, and use them to connect with chaos. So you can kind of do that where you extract myths from this is like for more obscure things. It's like you can extract from the myth like familiar spirits that you might know more about, that might have a more detailed myth to further connect with a more obscure figure, or you can take the myth and you can like take various words from the myth and use that in the ritual itself to like have a historical lineage behind it.
We know that myths also tend to intertwine with the actual culture of the time, but also in the political culture of the time. And there's a lot of examples, and we keep going back to Greece a lot with these just because we have a lot of historical context, we have a lot of things that are well preserved, so I don't want anybody to think we're just favoring that for no reason. We just happen to have a lot of historical context. But Greece had a lot of political things, and so you also have to look at what the culture of the time was there and what the political leaders or the political movements were, and why certain myths were more focused on, why certain deities may have been called upon, why certain myths may have been framed in certain ways, or why they may be changed over time to fit a certain political ideal or a certain political movement or a certain politician or leader's desires to shape the culture. And we see this a lot now. I mean, we see it a lot with like picking and choosing in the Bible and using certain passages to say why people are doing things on either side of the spectrum. But this is a thing that's always existed throughout history.
Absolutely. I think the most glaring example of this has to be revelations in the Bible. I'm bringing up a lot of kind of Abrahamic myths, but that's what I'm very culturally familiar with. So Revelations comes from an entheogenic experience of a mystic, and it very directly is talking about political things that were happening at the time. It's very obviously subtweeting like specific political leaders. The characters that are pulled into Revelations have very obvious ties to very specific political events. There are a ton of articles on this, a ton of books. You can read all about it. But it's probably the most glaringly obvious politically charged myth. It's very blatant. But people even knowing this will still look at it and see it as a literal point-by-point event of what is about to happen. But the way it happens doesn't really perfectly make sense in a modern society. And so when we look at these myths, knowing the political times of when they're written is so critical, because if you can, a lot of cultures are not super well preserved, like unlike Greece, right? Like a lot of these pagan cultures we don't have amazing records on. The mythology is kind of pulled together. We don't really know the practices of the original people, which is tragic. I hate that we don't have that material. But if you can find political and historical records, that will help you understand mythology to such a deeper level. If you can't, I think something to remember is that it could be talking about politics, and you should look at it and kind of say, do I think there might be a more like surface level explanation for why certain events are happening? Because like obviously a lot of the times we don't know, and we don't really know much about the culture at the time. Like people that are really into Celtic myth and magic, right? we really don't have great records on what the Celts were doing. The mythology and folklore is not very well preserved. Thankfully, we have some of it. But for people who are in this practice, they do have to do a lot of reconstructionism on their own. And doing that reconstructionism is really tricky work and takes a lot of research. Even though you don't have all the information, knowing as much as you could have is going to help you bridge those gaps. Because if whatever pantheon you're interested in doesn't have the amazing records that we have for, say, Greece, doing cultural research, looking for like interviews with historians, reading academic documents is going to really help you fill in the missing space that you don't have. Because a lot of pagans really do have to do that.
This ties into a lot of points that we covered before of like needing to diversify your research and making sure that you're fully understanding everything you're researching no matter what. And this will really tie you into a lot of like not just regular history, but I would highly recommend if you want to learn more about mythology and the cultural context, look into specifically art history, because a lot of the mythological context we can try to understand through the art, including like paintings if there were paintings, sculptures, buildings. A lot of the artistic parts are going to be a big key in what the context of any sort of myths were at the time. We see this most notably in Christian art, I would say. You can see the different times where the idea shifts and mythological shifts happen. Like you go from sweet, baby-faced, nice, kind Christ to, we actually have what our art history teacher called angry Christ, and it was comparing him to Jupiter and Zeus and being more angry, and all the paintings of him went from sweet and loving to everybody's going to go to hell, you need to repent. There was a lot more focus on hell, and it was to encourage more people to go to church, and so there were political ideas with that. There were a lot of paintings that were religious, because of course they had Jesus in the church and everything, but it was also about like the Reformations and when people were moving away from Catholicism to be Protestants or whatever they ended up being. And so it was like punishments for Protestants and Lutherans and whatever, people that were breaking away from the Catholic Church doctrine. And so, yes, it is religious art, and yes, there are certain myths that were brought up at the time, but the historical context was in regards to what people were doing. So art history is going to be big, especially if you can find professional lectures on it. If you have the ability to go to a college and go take an art history course, I highly, highly recommend it, because a good art history teacher like I had will definitely tell you how important the cultural context is, and the myths matching up with the cultural context will be a huge way to help you understand both.
I agree. I think when we get these incidents of kids on TikTok saying that gods killed someone or something like that, and we get these big like witchy scandals, people are taking these old myths without their context as very literal, and that is what kind of kills it. Because once again, everything is told by people, and people have agendas. And also when we talk about religion is largely and has historically largely been preserved by groups or organizations. Groups or organizations that are involved with religion, say the Catholic Church, say the temples of Greece, right? These were largely organized. While modern paganism is really not organized, like they're covens, like they're the Gardnerians, there's like the OTO or whatever, but there aren't like huge, massive, highly communicated bodies that have any political power in modern neo-paganism. Like, neo-pagan groups are very small, and they're largely focused on self-exploration. But historic paganism, back when paganism was the central religion of the world, it was organized. It was political. It had goals and aims. And so when we look at these ancient myths, and we think about who is telling them, we need to remember that there were elites involved with pagan religion. Pagan religion didn't always look how it does now. There's a reason why we call it either Reconstruction or Neo-Pagan, because what we have now is not what historic paganism was. We can get as close as we want, and some people try to get as close as possible, but truly, we can't recreate that fully. What modern pagan spirituality is looks very, very different from how it did back in ancient Greece. A great example of this is if you've read the Greek magical papyri, which is a like grimoire that's survived since ancient Greece. It's very ceremonial. There's influences of Jewish magic in it, which I find quite interesting, about like how religions sync together and all that. But it doesn't really look how a modern neo-pagan Wiccan ritual, right, is gonna look. And so I think we need to remember that we aren't exactly doing what the ancients were doing. We can try, but we don't have the ability to do that. And so I think we see ancient paganism and ancient pagan culture and myths through the lens that we think of it as unorganized and all about your own personal path and finding your own path like paganism is now. But I think we need to remember that paganism wasn't always like that. And I think that's another lens that people, including myself, kind of fall into, and that's yet another kind of trap in taking mythology literally or interpreting it in a way that isn't completely historically correct.
Another big reason that we have to remember that myths have changed over time is not just because the culture itself changed in the way of like ancient Greece being pagan changed how they were pagan. We also have to remember that the Christianization of regions changes a lot of mythology, and it's in part due to Christians saying, look how awful these people and their gods are, let's show how bad they are, and so the myths get twisted, or they get slated as they're all demons, look at the terrible, awful things that they do. And some of the big notable examples I have are the Hades and Persephone myth, where back in the day, the word that is used in the title of the myth meant to kidnap, and there was a tradition of if you didn't have your parents' permission, the husband would have to kidnap the wife. Or we have the Medusa myth with Athena. It originally was about Athena helping Medusa after an assault to help her protect herself from men forever. But it got twisted as, look how cruel these gods are, they subjected this poor woman after this other awful god did this thing. Continued to subject her because they are cruel and uncaring, and they're so awful, and our God is so good. So you have to know that myths will change, not just because of cultural shifts, but because of, in some ways, cultural invasion or actual literal invasions. It's not just the culture self-shifting, but other people having influence and rewriting that history because they don't want it to be followed.
Also, I think you mentioned the demon thing, and I think the linguistics of the word demon even actually plays a big part of this. So where we get the term demon would be the daimon, or the daemon, right? Which was a thing in Greece where it was a sort of like higher intelligence that gives advice, right? Like Plato or Socrates. I don't remember if it was Plato or Socrates. Had a daemon, and it helped him, and he believed that every person had a daemon, and that's pretty much what our modern conception of the holy guardian angel is. If you're a ceremonialist, you're going to be really familiar with that. But now we see demon used as a derogatory term for evil spirit. How did that transition happen? Well, the way that happened is because we had this daemon term, daemon kind of just became a term for other spirit, because all these lesser spirits kind of had like little offices or whatever. And so when the Jewish people began interacting with the ancient Greek people, because as we know, there was cultural exchange between them, like even in the Greek magical papyri, as I said, there's Jewish magic. So there was cultural exchange between the Greeks and the mystics of Judaism. So when the Jewish people interact with the Greek people, they saw their gods and spirits, and they didn't really know how to classify them, because they didn't really exist in the Jewish canon. So they saw this word daemon, right? And they're like, okay, well, this means anything else. So the term demon became just applied to any other spirit that wasn't like an angel or God, right? So it just got applied to everything. And it wasn't meant to be a negative thing at first. It was just kind of an other term. But as time evolved and Christianity got on the scene, demon became a term to refer to evil spirit. And then regressively, we began applying the term demon to malefic spirits from early Sumerian culture, because they used a different term. I don't remember what exact term they used, but so the term demon evolved in a way itself. So when we look at this like ancient use of the word demon, and we see these old gods being called demons, if you've looked at the Goetia, a lot of the gods in a lot of the demons in the Goetia are Sumerian local regional deities. Like I know the word Baal, which we know as the Goetic demon Baal, was just a term basically for random regional gods that people didn't like, and it was used just as like a term like, oh, you're random regional god, that's Baal, right? And so these demon names we have now are a lot of the time just random older gods that later got demonized. So, like, even the linguistics of stuff plays into this. When we look at these ancient cultural demons, it's not the same as a modern demon, right? And the way that demons and entities such as Baal have evolved from random local god that people just didn't like to a terrifying demon of the Goetia who must be put in a triangle of art and evoked by a practitioner, for it will kill you, is just even proof that, like, mythology is still evolving. Mythology is still growing. And now you're seeing people go back who are saying, oh, these demons are old gods, and are worshipping them like you would a god. And so even now the stuff's still shifting. The mythology is not finished evolving with Christianization. I think a lot of people stop their mythological analysis with the conversion. But a lot has happened since then, and right now we're in the middle of the neo-magical revival, the occult revival. And so mythology is still changing actively around us. Mythology is not an abstract thing that we learn and they're like, oh, it's so ancient, but rather a living tradition. Religion is living. It's a verb, right? You do religion. And so these myths are still changing, which is a beautiful thing and also something we really need to pay attention to.
One thing that I've noticed is that a lot of people will try to avoid certain gods based on their myths. I think that can really hinder someone because the myths themselves, this is like, especially with Greece and Zeus, if you're trying to understand the religion, you need to understand the context of those gods and that Zeus wasn't worshipped in the aspect of someone who would sleep around with women, usually. He was worshipped in the aspect of he's the greatest of all their gods. He's the chief god. In I forgot which era of Greece was the most recent era of Greece, at least because there's previous eras where that was different. But these gods weren't always worshipped in like the most negative aspects. And like Georgia was saying, some of these like bad ideas of the gods came around from the Christianization of the myths. So I think that it's important for neo-pagans, especially Reconstructionists, to understand the context of the myth and also understand that these gods aren't the myths. The myths explain the gods and flesh them out deeper, but they aren't the myths themselves, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I find the Zeus thing really interesting because I don't know if I've ever met a person who worships Zeus. I've met a lot of Greek pagans, but I don't know if I've ever actually met someone who worships Zeus. I think that leads into the thing of how what mythology looks like also depends on what, like, styles of gods are trendy. Because, oh, Nike, you worship Zeus? I'm sorry.
Well, I work with him very briefly. So part of deity work is that, at least for me, several gods have come and gone, but I did work with Zeus for a time. So he's definitely not common. I will grant you that. Most of the time it's on, like, a handful of really specific ones from different pantheons, but, like, yeah, he's not popular.
Sorry, I did not mean to erase your practice. But there are trends with gods, too, and trends with spirits. Like, when you look at Mycenaean Greece, almost all the gods that were very popular were these very chthonic gods, these very, like, dark and heavy gods. And then as you move to the next era of Greece, the popular gods become, like, Zeus and Aphrodite and Athena. And so when we look at religion, like, religion has, like, trends. Not saying, like, trends are necessarily a good thing in religion, but even now we're seeing trends. Like, I hadn't heard many people talking about the Fae until, like, 6 months ago, and now I feel like everyone talks about the Fae all the time. And I think just with myths, like, you need to realize that myths come and go, and gods come and go. Like, even in this very slow version, like Crowley's idea of aeonic succession, where you have these aeons that are periods of what religions are in power, and some theories on what's going forward. Like, even within these big trends, like paganism, Christianity, or whatever, there's still these minor trends that impact how mythology is read and seen.
The cultural context behind which gods are quote-unquote trendy back in the day, it is very true. In ancient times, like quote-unquote pre-civilization or very, very early civilization, we see a lot of, like, fertility gods, and then we start getting agricultural gods because agriculture starts to be a thing, and so it kind of reflects what society's values are at the time, and so we get these more, I would say, lofty gods, ones that are not very, like, survival-oriented, but are more society-oriented, like Zeus, who is not just a leader, but is also about, like, hosting people with graciousness and kindness. And you've got war gods, obviously, because war is just a thing throughout history, but it very much does key you in more to the historical context of what was going on, because it was what they had to focus on the most. And, you know, I think we also have this idea that people worship the entire pantheon, but it's more similar to the neo-pagan stuff than we might think it is in that aspect, that, you know, if you were a farmer, you had no reason to necessarily worship Hephaestus, and if you were a soldier, you might not be worshipping Hestia. It very much was, if they are relevant to you, you would probably focus more on them, with very few exceptions. So, my final thoughts on the subject are, as they tend to be, do your research, and don't limit your research to just witchcraft topics, because cultural context, art history context, other religions context in the region, geographical, all that's going to make a big difference, and try not to take the myths too literally or try to apply modern culture to them, because you won't be interpreting them correctly. Historical context matters for how you can apply them to your modern practice today.
My final thoughts are, like Nike, always research, double check everything. Make sure you're understanding the separations of different eras of mythology, like pre-Christian, post-Christian, those separations, even like further little separations, geographical separations. Always double check the cultural context. Make sure that you are understanding why these myths are being told, what messages they're saying, and like what you can extract from that and apply to yourself for any mythology. Always be sure that you're not falling into biases. Like, you're gonna have biases, but try to avoid them as much as possible and try to figure out what makes the most sense to you from the cultural context, from the historical context, from the political context especially, because politics play a huge role in religion, especially in ancient times. And just always do your research and understand what you're doing.
My final thoughts are that it's very important to take a very critical eye to mythology. When you look at mythology, think about who wrote it. Think about the archetypes it fulfills. Think about the cultural context. Think about the time period. And think about all of that when you go to extract. Think about how, is this a story that's trying to teach a lesson? Is this aimed towards children? Is this aimed towards adults? Is there a political message in this? What are all the layers of symbolism? What is this really trying to get across? How am I supposed to interpret it? And then once you go through all those questions, you can look at the kind of just material and see things like how the Fae dance or various plants that are used and think, this connects to that and I'm going to use that in my practice. When pulling from mythology, it's an amazing practice that can bring you so much success in your magic and can help you grow so quickly. But it needs to be done critically and carefully. And remember that sometimes you do need to take off our modern lens and take off this 2020 perception and go into a more historic understanding of the words, the things, the linguistics even, and just realize that there's so many layers of depth, symbolism, and meaning in these myths, especially since time has passed and we no longer are in that culture, that we have to consider things like cultural context. And then, through all that, get your information. Do a lot of research. Witchcraft books are great, and I read them all the time, but you sometimes need to read more than that and step outside of that box so that you can get the closest and most accurate information as possible to then feed your unverified personal gnosis and help you develop as a practitioner. So, this has been Georgina.
I've been Aiden.
I've been Nike.
And you've been listening to Occultism with a Side of Salt.